The year is 1987. The northern coast of Peru is a landscape defined by harsh winds, shifting sands, and the silent tombs of empires that faded long before the first European ships pierced the horizon. In this arid expanse, archaeologists breach a burial chamber that sends shockwaves through the academic world, uncovering the tomb of the Lord of Sipan. They find gold, they find jade, they find heavy ceremonial knives designed to sever the bounds between the mortal realm and the divine. The entire world gasped in collective awe, and almost overnight, the historical textbooks are rewritten. The conclusion drawn from this monumental discovery is immediate, unquestioned, and seemingly ironclad. Ancient Peru is declared a realm forged and ruled by the rigid hands of men. It is a world of male warriors shedding blood on the coastal sands, male priests commanding the movements of the cosmos, and male rulers holding absolute authority, while women are relegated strictly to the shadowed background of history. This narrative fits perfectly into the modern understanding of ancient civilizations, confirming our deeply held biases about the natural order of power. But what if that entire foundation is nothing more than an illusion built on a singular, incomplete truth? What if the earth itself has been quietly holding on to a secret that would shatter everything we thought we knew about the ancient Americas? Fast forward 19 years later to May 15, 2006, in the desolate Chicama Valley, 80 kilometers north of Trujillo. A shovel scraping through layers of sun-baked clay catches on something impossibly hard. It is not a golden chalice. It is not a sacrificial knife. It is a massive, cryptic bundle weighing 100 kilograms, meticulously bound in 26 thick layers of ancient fabric. Why is it buried beneath a pyramid that locals have for centuries spoken of in hushed tones as the Hill of the Sorcerer? What force of nature or will of the gods required such a complex, heavy seal? Welcome to Cryptic Realm, where we peel back the layers of forgotten epochs to question everything we have been told. Join us as we venture into the blinding light of the Peruvian desert, unraveling a mystery that proves our history is not nearly as settled as we want to believe. Subscribe and listen closely, because the dust is about to speak. The heat of the Sechura Desert does not merely warm the skin, it oppresses the earth, baking the ground until the surface cracks like old porcelain. It is a place where rain might not fall for 2 straight decades, leaving only the relentless, salty wind blowing in from the vast Pacific Ocean to carve away at the adobe walls of ancient temples. In this unforgiving environment, survival itself is a daily war against the elements. Yet it was precisely here, on this parched coastal strip, that the Moche civilization thrived centuries before the Inca ever set foot on the mountain trails leading to Cusco. The Moche were masters of the desert, engineers of massive irrigation canals, and builders of towering pyramids made from millions of sun-dried mud bricks. They were a society steeped in complex rituals, vibrant art, and a profound connection to the cycles of blood and water. For decades, modern society looked back at the Moche through a very specific lens. When the Lord of Sipan was pulled from the earth in 1987, he validated a pre-existing assumption. We found a king draped in martial glory, and so we concluded that the Moche Empire was a patriarchal military machine. We looked at the murals depicting brutal combat and captive sacrifices, and we automatically painted male faces onto every figure of authority. The textbooks codified this belief into undeniable fact. Women, the academic consensus agreed, might have served as priestesses in localized ceremonies, but they could never sit at the apex of the hierarchy. They could never be the supreme rulers wielding the power of life and death over an entire valley. This is the danger of historical interpretation. We often dig into the past not to discover what is actually there, but to find a mirror reflecting our own present societal structures. We assume that because recent history has been dominated by patriarchal systems, the ancient world must have naturally operated by the exact same rules. The conclusion from 1987 lasted exactly 19 years. It stood unchallenged until the desert decided it was time to correct the record. Imagine standing on the upper platform of the Huaca El Brujo pyramid in the blistering heat of December 2005. The air is so profoundly dry that a person's lips will begin to crack and bleed within a single hour of exposure. The harsh sunlight casts sharp, aggressive black shadows against the ancient sand. To dig here is an act of sheer physical endurance and mental fortitude. The local inhabitants of the region have known this pyramid for generations, passing down a name through the centuries, despite the violent arrival of the Spanish, the erasure of indigenous languages, and the imposition of a foreign religion. They called it Huaca El Brujo, the pyramid of the sorcerer. They did not know what was buried inside. They had never breached its deepest chambers, yet the cultural memory of the land preserved an aura of dark, spiritual power tied to this specific geographical coordinate. They felt the weight of the place. It is here that the established truths of the ancient world begin to fracture. When the shovel finally breaches the crucial layer on that fateful day in May 2006, it is not a gentle discovery. 2.5 meters beneath the northwestern courtyard of the pyramid, the earth yields a dense, solid cocoon. The sheer physical mass of the object is staggering. It measures 1.8 meters in length and weighs a formidable 100 kilograms. According to the strictest canons of Moche burial practices, the head of the entity within the bundle is oriented perfectly toward the south. This is not a common grave. This precise, calculated alignment, combined with the sheer volume of resources required to create such an enormous funerary package, screams of supreme authority. In the Moche world, only the absolute highest echelon of the nobility was granted a burial of this magnitude. The researchers standing in the dusty trench know instantly that they have found a monarch. The anticipation is a heavy, almost suffocating presence in the dry air. They expect to find another Lord of Seppan. They expect to find another male warrior, another bearded ruler whose violent exploits defined the politics of the Chicama Valley. The unwrapping of the bundle is a process of agonizing slowness and profound reverence. Each layer of ancient material is a page in a forgotten book. The archaeologists peel back the first outer layer of rough cloth, then the second, then the third. In total, there are 26 distinct layers of finely woven cotton. Woven into this massive textile fortress are plates of gilded copper designed to protect the occupant from both physical decay and spiritual interference. Beneath the mountains of fabric and metal, they find a face. It is not a face of flesh, but an intricate mask made of embroidered fabric, staring blindly up into the harsh Peruvian light. and beneath that mask lies the true revelation. It is human skin, preserved by the mercilessly dry climate until it resembles old, tanned parchment. The preservation is terrifyingly perfect. But it is not the preservation that makes the researchers freeze in their tracks. It is the realization of who is looking back at them. As the final layers of cotton are carefully pulled away, the silence in the excavation trench becomes absolute. The timeline of history snaps. Everything we thought we knew about the Moche, about the Andes, about the natural flow of human power, crumbles like the dry clay beneath their boots. The entity wrapped in 100 kilograms of cotton and gold, the supreme ruler buried beneath the pyramid of the sorcerer, the monarch aligned with the sacred south, is not a man. The desert does not yield its secrets to the impatient, nor does it reward those who come seeking quick glory. It demands a toll paid in sweat, in doubt, and in the relentless passage of time. How long can a man dig through empty sand before he begins to doubt his own sanity? For archaeologist Regulo Franco Jordan, the answer was measured not in days or months, but in a grueling span of 15 years. Imagine dedicating a decade and a half of your life to a single patch of arid earth. Since the early 1990s, he had stood on the sun-baked terraces of the Huaca El Brujo complex, staring down into the dust. He was 46 years old when the earth finally spoke back to him, but the road to that moment was paved with a profound and isolating kind of desperation. Excavating in the remote corners of Peru is not a quiet, academic endeavor conducted entirely in the safety of sun hats and meticulous brushstrokes. It is a frontier war against both the elements and human greed. For 15 long years, the archaeological team operated under the constant, suffocating shadow of the Huaqueros, the ruthless, organized tomb raiders of the region. These were not mere scavengers. They were nocturnal phantoms who descended upon the ancient sites under the cover of darkness, armed not only with shovels and pickaxes, but with automatic weapons. The nights in the Chicama Valley were often punctuated by the cold, metallic sounds of looting, as armed gangs violently tore through the sacred adobe structures, ripping away the history of their own ancestors to sell on the black market. The tension was a living thing, a heavy vibration in the night air. And alongside the threat of violence came the quiet, gnawing dread of financial ruin. Archaeology is an expensive pursuit of ghosts, and ghosts do not pay the bills. The Wheezy Foundation, the primary financial lifeline keeping the Huaca El Brujo project alive, had been pouring resources into the dry sand for 15 years, with agonizingly little to show for it. There were a few faded murals, some crumbling adobe walls, the scattered anonymous bones of ancient laborers, but nothing that would justify the massive expenditure of time and capital. They were standing on the very edge of the financial abyss, inches away from permanently abandoning the site to the mercy of the wind and the grave robbers. But then, the earth shifted. The first whisper of a revelation did not come in the form of gold, but in the solemn language of destruction. The shovel scraped against a layer of charred, blackened wood. Beneath the merciless sun, the team uncovered burned wooden figures, oxidized copper vessels, and a thick, deliberate layer of white ash. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like the remnants of a forgotten hearth, but to a Moche specialist, it was a siren song. In the complex cosmology of the Moche civilization, You did not simply bury a figure of supreme importance and walk away. You sealed them beneath a barrier of ritual fire. Fire was the great transformer, the ultimate purifier, the element that severed the ties between the breathing world above and the silent, eternal realm below. When Regulo Franco Jordan saw that layer of ash, a profound realization washed over him. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had bled for this land, that something monumental lay hidden directly beneath their boots. They were not looking at a simple grave. They were standing on the roof of a carefully engineered cosmic vault. What kind of power requires a blazing inferno to keep it contained? What manner of human being necessitates a seal of burned earth and scorched metal? The discovery of the ash layer was merely the beginning of an agonizing test of patience. Knowing that a monumental discovery lay just beneath them, the team could not simply tear through the earth. Archaeology is the science of organized destruction. To move too quickly is to erase the very context you are trying to understand. For 6 agonizing months, they excavated millimeter by millimeter, documenting every grain of displaced sand, until they reached the depth of 2.5 meters below the northwestern courtyard, and there, resting in the absolute darkness of a sealed adobe chamber, lay the colossal bundle. Moving a 100-kilogram cocoon of fragile ancient textiles is an operation fraught with terror. One wrong movement, one sudden shift in weight, and 17 centuries of history could crumble into unrecognizable dust. Transporting the bundle to the laboratory in Lima was a pilgrimage of high anxiety, a slow march carrying a sleeping deity from the desert into the sterile, unforgiving light of modern science. When the time finally came to breach the bundle, the atmosphere in the laboratory was thick with an almost religious reverence. The unwrapping of a high-status Moche mummy is not a mechanical process. It is an intimate, reverse engineering of an ancient funeral rite. The outer layer was heavy, coarse cotton, woven to withstand the crushing weight of the earth. As the specialists meticulously cut and peeled back this first defense, they encountered a second layer, then a third, and then a fourth. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Why wrap a human body in 26 distinct layers of fabric? It was as if the ancient undertakers were desperately trying to insulate the occupant from the ravages of time. Or perhaps, to insulate the living world from the overwhelming spiritual radiation of the occupant. As the researchers ventured deeper into the textile labyrinth, the layers became increasingly ornate. Hidden within the folds of ancient cotton were gleaming plates of gilded copper, catching the laboratory lights with a warm, defiant glow. The metal was woven directly into the fabric, creating a localized armor against decay. And then, peering through the final layers, they found the face. It was not a human face, not yet. It was a spectacular, haunting mask made entirely of embroidered fabric. The threads, dyed in vibrant hues that had miraculously survived the centuries, formed a visage that stared blindly upward. It was a stylized representation, a perfect, unchanging face designed to represent the deceased in the journey through the underworld. Removing this final mask felt like crossing an invisible boundary. Beneath the false face of woven thread lay the true face of the ancient monarch. The laboratory fell into a silence so profound it felt as though the air itself had been drawn out of the room. The skin of the entity was flawlessly preserved, appearing like tightly stretched tanned parchment over delicate bone. The Moche did not typically embalm their dead. In most cases, the bodies either dried naturally into brittle husks or rotted away completely in the dampness of an El Niño year. But this burial was different. The attendants had meticulously coated the body in cinnabar, a brilliant, toxic red mineral made from mercury ore. To the Moche, the vibrant crimson of cinnabar was the physical manifestation of life force, a mineral substitute for human blood. By soaking the cotton and the body in this heavy red powder and sealing the chamber perfectly against moisture, they had accidentally created an immaculate chemical time capsule. The cold Peruvian current offshore and the bone-dry air of the desert had done the rest. The preservation was so unnervingly perfect that if you were to seal an apple in a vacuum, leave it in the driest desert on Earth for 1,700 years, and open it today, it would still carry the scent of the orchard. But it was not the cinnabar, nor the gilded copper, nor the sheer mass of the burial bundle that caused the researchers to step back from the examination table in stunned disbelief. It was the undeniable biological truth staring back at them. As physical anthropologist John Verano of Tulane University approached the remains, he did not see the robust, heavy skeletal structure of a male warrior. He examined the cranial features, the delicate line of the jaw, and, most crucially, the architecture of the pelvic bones. The team of textile specialists, led by Arabel Fernandez, who had spent weeks pulling away the layers thread by thread, stood waiting for the verdict. The scientific method demands rigorous proof, and they checked and rechecked the anatomical markers over the course of several agonizing weeks. There was no room left for error. There was no ambiguity hiding in the ancient bones. The supreme ruler of the Chicama Valley, the monarch buried with all the pomp and circumstance of a living god, the commander whose grave required a seal of ritual fire, was a woman. She was a young woman, barely in her mid-20s. For 19 years, Regulo Franco Jordan had dug through the desert completely convinced that the pinnacle of Moche society belonged exclusively to men. The entire global community of historians and archaeologists had built their theories, their academic papers, and their museum exhibits on the unshakable foundation of a patriarchal empire. To understand the sheer magnitude of the cognitive dissonance in that room, you must imagine opening the golden sarcophagus of Tutankhamun, only to find a female pharaoh whose existence had never even been hinted at in the thousands of texts and carvings left behind. The paradigm did not just shift, it shattered completely, leaving behind a profound and terrifying question. If we were this completely, fundamentally wrong about the very nature of power in the ancient Americas, what else has our arrogance blinded us to? What other monumental truths are we currently walking over, simply because we refuse to believe they could possibly exist? The skin of the dead does not usually speak, as the relentless march of time typically reduces the human form to anonymous, silent bone. But the Señora de Cao was different, preserved in a chemical slumber that defied the centuries, leaving her flesh with a story to tell. When the laboratory lights proved insufficient to read the fading ancient ink, the photographers of the El Brujo expedition turned to infrared imaging, using invisible wavelengths of light to bypass the damage of time and reveal the pigment that had begun to fade upon its sudden exposure to the modern air. What emerged from the monitors was not a random assortment of aesthetic designs, but a highly sophisticated, deeply symbolic language inscribed directly onto her biological canvas. Imagine the agonizing, sacred process of having these symbols permanently hammered into your flesh, using cactus spines and charcoal, a trial of pain that cemented your divine status in the eyes of the mortal realm. Winding down both of her forearms were the unmistakable, sinuous forms of snakes. In the complex cosmology of the Andes, the serpent is not a creature of evil, but a powerful symbol of profound healing, and the oracle, a conduit that slithers effortlessly between the sunlit world of the living and the dark, echoing caverns of the underworld. To wear the snake is to possess the authority to bridge the gap between life and death. Sprawled across the backs of her hands, exactly where anyone bowing before her would look, were the intricate shapes of spiders. The spider is the eternal mark of the master weaver and the diviner of fate, a creature that pulls the threads of the universe from its own body to construct a delicate, deadly architecture. She was not merely a ruler, she was the architect of her people's destiny, pulling the strings of political and spiritual life in the Chicama Valley. But the menagerie of power did not end there. The infrared lenses revealed crabs, the armored scavengers of the coast, serving as the ultimate symbol of the boundless sea and its fierce fertility. Beside them swam the catfish, the whiskered lords of the muddy river depths, representing a direct and unbreakable connection to the subterranean world. Stalking across her skin were jaguars, the apex predators of the South American continent, the undisputed, terrifying embodiment of earthly martial power. And there, resting with supreme authority upon her right shoulder, was the lunar animal, the absolute main deity of the Moche pantheon. This was a terrifying, divine chimera, possessing the twisting, coiled body of a serpent and the roaring, ferocious head of a lion. We must discard our modern notions of body art to understand the gravity of these markings. This was not mere bodily decoration. This was a living, breathing resume etched into her very flesh. Her skin was an archive, declaring unequivocally that she was a healer, an oracle, a weaver, a queen of the sea, a bearer of jaguar strength, and the chosen, living vessel for the lunar god. Anyone who looked upon her bare arms instantly understood her absolute, terrifying title, without a single word ever being spoken. How does a society conceptualize power when it is physically bound to the body of a 20-something-year-old woman? We are forced to confront our own deeply ingrained prejudices about gender and authority. When we picture a supreme commander, we do not typically picture a young woman covered in spiders and serpents, yet the earth insists upon this truth. The shock of her spiritual authority, however, was immediately eclipsed by the chilling reality of her physical dominion. As the archaeologists meticulously cleared the space around her bundled body, they did not find the delicate, passive tools we historically associate with female nobility. Beside her lay 2 massive war clubs and 23 spear throwers, the lethal mechanisms designed to hurl wooden darts with enough kinetic energy to shatter a human rib cage. These were not fragile, decorative replicas made for the afterlife. This weapon was real, it was incredibly heavy, and it was fiercely non-ceremonial. To wield a heavy war club requires immense physical strength and a willingness to engage in the brutal, intimate violence of hand-to-hand combat. Why would a society bury a young woman with a military arsenal capable of equipping a small vanguard? The logic of archaeology is cold and unforgiving. You are buried with the tools of your trade, with the symbols of your earthly domain. She was not a figurehead kept safely behind the high adobe walls of the pyramid. She was a warlord. She commanded the armies that marched across the desert sands. The historical narrative that insisted the Moche was an empire built exclusively by male warriors began to disintegrate under the sheer weight of those 23 spear throwers. We have been conditioned to believe that the battlefield is a strictly male domain, an arena where women are either victims or distant prizes. But the Señora de Cao shatters this paradigm, forcing us to envision a world where a woman orchestrated campaigns, dictated military strategy, and perhaps even stood on the front lines, the gilded copper of her armor reflecting the blinding coastal sun. Yet the ultimate terror and majesty of her reign wasn't found in the crushing weight of her war clubs, but in a small, gleaming object placed deliberately beside her. Buried alongside the commander was a heavy silver goblet. To the untrained observer, it might seem like a simple drinking vessel, an artifact of ancient luxury. But to those who have spent decades studying the haunting, violent murals painted on the walls of Moche temples, the goblet is an object of sheer horror. It is the exact same type of vessel depicted in the elaborate ceremonial artwork, gripped tightly by high priestesses in the act of drinking the blood of sacrificed captive warriors. The murals show men stripped of their armor, their throats severed, their life force drained into these specific silver cups to appease the demanding gods of the desert. For years, historians looked at these murals and assumed the female figures were mythological beings, or perhaps subordinate priestesses playing a minor role in a male-dominated ritual. They could not fathom that a flesh-and-blood female ruler actually held the cup. But modern science does not rely on assumptions. It relies on evidence. When researchers placed the interior of this specific silver goblet under the scrutiny of laboratory analysis, they did not find it empty. Archaeologists extracted microscopic traces of organic material from deep within its silver bowl. The conclusion was inescapable, horrifying, and profoundly paradigm-shifting. This goblet was not a theatrical prop. She actually drank the blood. She commanded the vast, complex machinery of state-sponsored sacrifice, deciding which prisoners of war would breathe their last upon the altar of the Huaca el Brujo. She held the absolute power of life and death, an authority so supreme and so violent that it completely obliterates the modern archetype of the gentle, nurturing female leader. She was a god on earth, a bringer of rain, a commander of armies, and an executioner, holding the fate of the Chicama Valley in her intricately tattooed hands, 4 full centuries before the Moche Empire eventually collapsed into the dust. And she achieved all of this, amassed all of this incomprehensible power while she was just 20-something years old. If a single tomb can completely dismantle a century of established historical consensus, how many other lies have we accepted as objective truth? What other phantom empires are waiting out there in the dark, ready to prove that the natural order of the world is nothing but a temporary illusion? If you drop a stone into a still pond, the ripples do not simply vanish. They travel outward, disturbing the surface long after the initial impact has faded from view. The unearthing of the Señora de Cao in 2006 was not merely an isolated anomaly, a strange glitch in the established matrix of history. It was a key that violently unlocked a door we did not even know was sealed shut. After that monumental discovery, archaeologists across the globe experienced a collective awakening, forcing them to look backward, to aggressively reevaluate the old, dusty findings that had been gathering shadows in museum archives. They began to realize that the evidence of supreme female power had been staring them in the face for decades, obscured only by the heavy, suffocating blindfold of modern prejudice. Let us travel 40 kilometers north of the Chicama Valley, moving through the shimmering heat of the desert until we reach the ruins of San Jose de Moro. This is a massive, sprawling ceremonial center of the Moche civilization, a place where the earth has been meticulously excavated since the year 1991. Here, under the relentless Peruvian sun, archaeologist Luis Jaime Castillo Butters from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru spent 8 grueling, exhausting seasons digging through the layers of time. Across those 8 seasons of careful excavation, his team unearthed 8 distinct tombs belonging to the absolute highest echelon of the ancient society. If we were to apply the rigid logic of the 20th century history books, we would expect to find 8 powerful warlords, 8 men of violence and political cunning. But how many biological males were found ruling from the darkness of these elite chambers? 0. Every single one of the 8 supreme rulers pulled from the earth at San Jose de Moro was a woman. They were reigning queens and high priestesses, buried with exquisite silver goblets and the heavy, curved blades of ceremonial tumi knives. Surrounding their physical remains were intricate pieces of painted ceramics, depicting brutal scenes of ritual human sacrifice. At the very center of these painted, chaotic scenes of blood and devotion stands a towering figure wearing a high, elaborate crown, calmly extending a sacred chalice. For an entire century, the academic establishment looked at this painted figure and confidently, without a shadow of a doubt, labeled it a male priest in their textbooks. It was an assumption born of profound arrogance. But after the Señora de Cao stepped out of the shadows, the illustrations had to be frantically redrawn, because that towering figure holding the cup of life and death was a woman, and it had always been a woman. In an interview with the Agence France-Presse in August of 2013, Castillo delivered a statement that struck the academic world with even more precision than the initial discovery itself. He stated unequivocally that these women were not merely performing localized religious rituals. They were actively governing the territory, reigning as the undisputed queens of Moche society. 8 supreme female rulers buried one after another, an unbroken lineage of matriarchal authority with not a single male king to interrupt their dynasty. To grasp the sheer mathematical impossibility of this being a mere coincidence, imagine yourself as a cybernetic archaeologist of the distant future, excavating a national cemetery of the 21st century. If you were to dig into the earth and find 8 consecutive graves belonging exclusively to female presidents, the only logical, scientifically sound conclusion you could draw is that you were looking at a nation entirely ruled by women. And in drawing that conclusion, you would be absolutely correct. But the ghosts of the desert do not belong to the Moche alone. The timeline pushes forward, the climate shifts, empires crumble, and new powers rise to fill the vacuum. Fast forward to the year 2012 and shift your gaze southward to the coastal region of Ancash. A joint Polish-Peruvian archaeological expedition led by Miloš Giersch of the University of Warsaw is carefully breaking the seal on a different kind of darkness. They are excavating the remnants of the Wari culture, the formidable people who dominated the Andes after the decline of the Moche, flourishing roughly between the years 700 and 1000 of our era. The Wari were not just a localized kingdom. They were the first true expansive empire of the high Andes. Beneath the rocky soil, the team achieves the impossible. They locate the first completely untouched, unlooted Wari tomb in the entire history of Andean archaeology. It is a miracle of preservation, a space the violent grave robbers had somehow missed, protected by the silence of the earth. Inside the pitch-black chamber, the beams of their flashlights illuminate more than 1,000 priceless artifacts, objects forged from solid gold, silver, and ancient bronze. There are heavy ceremonial drinking vessels and astonishingly delicate weaving tools crafted from pure gold. But it is the human architecture of the tomb that truly shatters the mind. The subterranean vault contains 68 human bodies. Of those 68 individuals, 58 are women. This is not a harem built for the pleasure of a dead king. Positioned in separate, highly decorated lateral chambers, sitting upright upon literal thrones in a posture of eternal command, are 3 distinct Wari queens. They were not buried as consorts. They were entombed as the absolute sovereign rulers of a sprawling, violent empire that stretched for a staggering 1,000 kilometers along the jagged Pacific coast. And the 55 other women buried in the surrounding space were not expendable servants or enslaved concubines thrown into the darkness. The anthropological evidence strongly suggests that many of them possessed high social status, forming a complex, elite female court that governed the empire. The drumbeat of discovery continues, refusing to let the old myths rest. In the year 2022, Professor Lisa Trevor from Columbia University leads an excavation at Pañamarca, another colossal center of Moche power. Beneath 14 centuries of crushing, suffocating sand, her team excavates an architectural marvel, a grand hall lined with imposing pillars. The adobe walls of this buried chamber are covered in vibrant, intricate frescoes. Dominating the visual narrative of the ancient paint is the image of a woman wearing an elaborate crown, seated heavily upon a solid throne. This is not an abstract depiction of a celestial goddess floating in the ether. This is the portrait of a flesh and blood, earthly ruler. She is shown clutching the heavy, unmistakable attributes of political and earthly authority, the exact same physical objects that the confident textbooks of the 1990s had universally and unquestioningly assigned to men. Do you comprehend the terrifying speed at which our understanding of human existence has been overwritten? In a mere 16 years, from 2006 to 2022, the entire foundational architecture of how we view the pre-Inca world was violently turned upside down. We are no longer talking about a single, confusing tomb that can be dismissed by arrogant scholars. We are no longer talking about 2 isolated cases of female power in a sea of men. We are looking at a vast, undeniable, and unbroken chain of matriarchal authority that spans across multiple centuries, across vast geographical distances, and across entirely different imperial cultures. The history we were taught was not merely incomplete. It was fundamentally, aggressively wrong. What happens to our understanding of the present when the foundational pillars of our past are revealed to be nothing but a collective hallucination? Let us step away from the sun-baked sand and enter the sterile, humming environment of a laboratory in Lima in the year 2017. where the ancient world meets the razor-sharp edge of modern forensic science. The skull of the supreme ruler rests on a stainless steel examination table, completely detached from the golden weapons and the heavy layers of woven cotton. A Brazilian team of forensic sculptors, led by the renowned Cicero Moraes, a man who has previously resurrected the faces of Egyptian pharaohs and Catholic saints from anonymous bone, is tasked with an impossible resurrection. They feed the dimensions of her skull into a complex topographical scanner, generating a flawless three-dimensional digital model. Layer by microscopic layer, the computer algorithms reconstruct the lost muscle tissue, the fat deposits, and the skin thickness based on precise anthropometric data derived from the indigenous populations of the northern coast. It takes 9 agonizing months of computational rendering and anatomical adjustments to pull her across the abyss of time. When the final rendering is complete and the digital eyes finally open on the monitor, the archaeologists staring at the screen are completely disarmed. They are expecting the terrifying visage of a warlord, a face hardened by violence, command, and the drinking of human blood. Instead, looking back at them with a calm, almost serene expression, is an incredibly ordinary 25-year-old girl. She has an oval face, the prominent high cheekbones typical of the coastal Moche people, and a smooth, gentle curve to her brow. There is no visible ferocity, no inherent cruelty etched into her features. It is a face you could easily walk past in the bustling, modern markets of Trujillo today without giving it a second glance. And it is precisely this breathtaking normalcy that strikes the heaviest psychological blow. You are forced to reconcile this gentle, youthful face with the absolute terror of her reality. You must imagine this young woman, barely in her mid-20s, standing at the terrifying apex of the Huaca El Brujo pyramid, draped in a cloak of blinding gilded copper, coldly calculating which of the neighboring valleys to plunge into war, and deciding which shivering captives will have their throats opened to appease the sun. How does so much localized omnipotence reside behind such an unremarkable, human face? But the forensic analysis did not stop at her reconstructed smile. It pushed deeper into the architecture of her bones, uncovering a tragedy that violently strips away the illusion of her divinity. A meticulous examination of her pelvic structure revealed the unmistakable, characteristic scarring that occurs during the late stages of pregnancy and the violent trauma of childbirth. The medical conclusion is overwhelmingly clear, painting a picture of devastating biological vulnerability. The supreme ruler of the Chicama Valley, the woman who commanded armies and communed with the roaring lunar god, did not die in the glory of battle, nor was she assassinated by treacherous rivals in the dark corridors of her palace. She died from severe postpartum complications, likely a catastrophic hemorrhage or a rapid, overwhelming blood infection. It was the most brutally common, mundane cause of female mortality in the era before the discovery of antibiotics. The bitter irony of her demise is almost too heavy to bear. The most powerful woman on the northern coast of Peru, the living deity who literally held the power of life and death over thousands of subjects in her tattooed hands, was ultimately killed by the exact same biological hazard that claimed the lives of the poorest, most anonymous peasant women grinding corn in the dust of the outer villages. The gilded copper armor, the terrifying war clubs, and the deep, abiding fear of her subjects offered absolutely zero protection against the cold, impartial mechanics of human reproduction. Earthly power, no matter how absolute or divinely mandated, cannot negotiate with biology. This brings us to the profound, lingering injustice of her memory. We call her the Señora de Cao, the Lady of Cao, but you must understand that this is a ghost's title, a modern label slapped onto her by archaeologists 17 centuries after her lungs stopped drawing the desert air. We have absolutely no idea what her real name was. The ancient Andean cultures never developed a formal, phonetic writing system. They possessed no alphabets, no stone tablets etched with royal decrees. They recorded their histories and their tax records using the quipu, an unbelievably complex mathematical language constructed entirely from knotted strings of dyed wool, a system that modern cryptographers are still struggling to fully decode. Because of this silence, her true name, the sound that made her enemies tremble and her soldiers fall to their knees, evaporated into the wind the moment her civilization collapsed. And how has the modern world chosen to honor this woman who completely rewrote the history of the Americas? When the Lord of Sipan, the male warrior priest, was discovered in 1987, Peru experienced an explosive, nationwide surge of patriotic pride. His bearded, authoritative face was printed on postage stamps, minted onto national currency, and plastered across the glossy pages of every school textbook. He became the undisputed, heavily marketed symbol of the pre-Columbian nation. But the Señora de Cao remains a stranger in her own land. In 2009, the government opened a small, quiet museum dedicated to her remains in the remote, dusty village of Magdalena de Cao, 60 kilometers away from the main tourist hubs of Trujillo. Only one local bus travels there each day. The entrance ticket costs roughly $2.50. The single most important, paradigm-shattering archaeological discovery of the 21st century lies silently in a climate-controlled glass sarcophagus, maintained artificially at 18 degrees Celsius and 45% humidity. The exact same perfect environmental parameters that the merciless desert provided her completely for free for 1,700 years. She rests in a place where the massive, air-conditioned tourist buses simply do not bother to go. History, as it so often does, has been cruel to her twice. It was cruel the first time when it buried her under the sand and forgot her entirely for 17 centuries. And it was cruel the second time when it finally remembered her, but stubbornly refused to speak her truth loudly enough to drown out the old, comfortable lies. If we accept the undeniable physical evidence that women ruled the Andean coast with absolute, terrifying authority for nearly 1,000 years, stretching from the early days of the Moche through the expansive, sprawling empire of the Wari, we are forced to confront a massive, terrifying void in the timeline. What broke the world? Because by the time the mighty Inca Empire consolidated its grip on the Andes around the year 1438, the social architecture had violently, irreversibly shifted. The Inca built a rigid, unyielding patriarchal machine. The supreme ruler, the Sapa Inca, was strictly male. The regional governors, the curachas, were male. The military commanders were exclusively male. The vibrant, dynamic female power of the coast was aggressively systematically dismantled and pushed into the shadows. Under the Inca, high-status women were largely relegated to the cloisters of the Sun Temple, forced into the role of the Akla, the chosen virgins whose primary duties were brewing ceremonial beer and weaving fine garments for the male nobility. The authority of the war club and the blood goblet was entirely stripped away from them. Something completely shattered the matriarchal foundations between the 6th and the 10th centuries, and because of the silent, knotted strings of the Quipu, we have no written manifesto explaining why the men took over. Was it a sudden, apocalyptic shift in the climate? Geologists know that around the year 600, a catastrophic, monstrous El Niño event struck the coast, bringing decades of torrential, unprecedented rain that literally melted the mud brick pyramids and washed the vital irrigation canals into the sea. When the crops fail and the gods seemingly abandon the people, society often regresses into a state of brutal, primal survival. Did the starvation and the chaos force the culture to reorganize itself entirely around the physical violence of male warlords fighting over the last scraps of fertile land? Or was it a slow, grinding, centuries-long war of attrition against encroaching mountain tribes, a conflict so desperate that the matriarchal structures simply could not survive the perpetual meat grinder of generational combat? We may never find the exact mechanism of the collapse, but the silence of the earth leaves us with a heavy, irrefutable fact. 17 centuries ago, in the arid, unforgiving expanse of the Chicama Valley, a 25-year-old woman with the symbols of the cosmos tattooed into her skin commanded legions of armed men, drank the warm blood of her defeated enemies from a silver chalice, and buried her political rivals beneath towering pyramids of sun-dried earth. The next time someone tells you that the current structure of human society is simply the natural order of things, the next time you hear the phrase that men have always ruled and women have always followed, I want you to remember the heavy, deafening thud of those 23 spear throwers hitting the laboratory table. Everything you think you know about who naturally holds power, who fights the wars, and who dictates the future is nothing more than a tiny, blurry snapshot of the last 500 years. Before that, the world looked radically, terrifyingly different. And we are only just beginning to wake up to this reality, uncovering the truth literally one dark tomb every 10 years. Are we the pinnacle of human social evolution, or are we merely living in a temporary, highly localized, patriarchal glitch in a much longer, forgotten story? If the realization that your history books are filled with comfortable fiction has unsettled you, if you feel the urge to keep digging through the illusions, hit the subscribe button and join us in the cryptic realm. You will not want to miss our next descent into the darkness. We will be traveling further south into the baking, featureless plains of Nazca. In the year 2023, anomalous radar scans detected something massive buried deep beneath those famous, incomprehensible lines drawn in the dirt. It is a discovery so completely disruptive, so inherently dangerous to the established timeline of human migration, that 2 lead archaeologists have already abruptly resigned from the project, and a third has completely severed all contact with the international press. The truth is out there, vibrating beneath the sand. Until next time, keep questioning the light.